guys, it's Sam, and today I'm going to talk about my most disappointing reads of 2020. So unlike my favorite books of 2020, I'm not ranking this one. I know, boo, hiss. But the thing is like not all of these are like 1-star reads. They're most disappointing reads. So I don't really have a way to rank them. Like I can't think of it that way. There's gonna be some that are obviously like more disappointing than others, I guess. It's a little bit more complicated than the favorites video because there's some books on here that are like 3 stars or possibly, I think there's even some 4 stars on here, but they just weren't what I expected, therefore disappointing. I have 13 books. So the first book is The Flat Share by Beth O'Leary. This is a very common theme on this list as far as books that were not marketed appropriately. I'm not going to go into a synopsis for every single book on this list or anything, but this was definitely marketed and even like talked about in the hype for it as being a adult contemporary romance, and it's really just like an adult contemporary fiction. There is a like romance element. The whole thing is that the two main characters are in a room share. Like she uses the bed during the night and he uses it during the day. Like they've split the apartment, but they're not in the apartment at the same time. And they sort of develop a relationship and friendship through like leaving post-it notes and things for each other. And what the thing is like the romance element of it was not like the main piece of it, which is fine, but then I don't really feel like that's a romance personally. So this book was fine, nothing was like wrong with it, but it was just marketed in a way that made it feel like it's gonna be more romancy than it actually was. So I didn't get what I was expecting, therefore disappointed. Next is Someday in Paris by Olivia Lara. I think I gave this book 1 star. This is a adult contemporary romance, and I'll be talking about this more in my couples video as well, but this is basically like a magical soulmates timeline thing. So they like meet each other. I don't remember all the details. I think I read it in like the spring. They meet each other and they are like connected, but stuff keeps them apart like the whole book. So basically you spend the whole book waiting for them to get together and they pretty much don't. I think they do at some point. But I don't know if there's a happily ever after. There might be, I don't remember. But the fact that it's in question in my head already kind of says something for you. And like they're just kept apart continuously. There's like no payoff. And I just expected one of those like angsty, like keeping them apart things, but not like the whole book. Like you don't even really get to see them together. So it's like, what am I pulling for? It was not a good time from what I expected. Then we have The Immortalist by Chloe Benjamin. This is an adult literary fiction story. Basically follows a family, the 4 siblings get told at the beginning of the book like what their death day is going to be. They go to like a psychic or something. And then it follows their lives like, especially right before their like supposed death days or whatever. And I expected this to be like a little bit more magical. A friend had recommended it to me and lent it to me and I held off on it for a long time because it held like this special kind of like place. I wanted to be in a good place when I read it, blah, blah, blah. And it just wasn't very good to me. I think I gave it 2 stars. Like there were some discussions about like cultural things and like families, but ultimately very forgettable for me. Like that very distinct brand of literary fiction that's like sadness porn that a lot of lit fic books do that I'm just like, no man, like you don't always need to do this. So it was just like blah in that way. I wanted to feel more for it and like be tugged in more and I wasn't. My battery died, so I hope I'm not picking up in the middle of a sentence and didn't finish my thought. The next book was A Sorrow Fierce and Falling by Jessica Cluess. This is the final book in the Kingdom on Fire series, which is a series that I really liked and I actually think it's very underhyped. It's like a Victorian bunch of different, like there's like magicians, witches, sorcerers. And in the first book our main character is discovered to be like the only female sorcerer and like everything kind of goes from there and there's all these like eldritch beings that they're fighting. It's really cool, but this last book was way too fast. Like this could have been a 4-book series and it wasn't, probably because it wasn't getting enough hype and stuff, but this really could have been 4 books because so much happens in this book and it wasn't, none of it was bad. I talk about this in my review for the series or this book, I forget what I did, but it wasn't bad stuff, but it all like needed more time. And that's what was so disappointing because the series is like so good and full of like so much potential, but it could have been better if it had more time. Then we have the final 2 books in the His Bright Ascendancy series. The first book being The Tiger's Daughter, which is one of my favorite books of I think like 2017 or something. Really loved it, but the final 2 books in the series were just like meh. Like I barely remember them. I still really like the fact that these are a fantasy series that's centered around a female-female romance, like 2 warrior women in love, and they're basically like gods or demigods. Like it's cool. Like the premise is really cool, but they're very long, not a ton like happens, and like it just doesn't quite meet the standard of like what it could be. And that was just disappointing because like the first book was like one of my favorites and I loved it, and the second book was like very much downhill. And the third book was like fine. This was the third one. It's fine, but it's still like, it's so long. And like, I just expected more from the series after the first book, and it just doesn't live up to its potential, which is true of a lot of these on my list. Next is a book that I'm like kind of mad at its fandom about, and that is Simple Wild by K.A. Tucker. This is a book that at least a few years ago, I don't know if people's opinions have changed over the years, but I used to hear like basically every romance reader that I know love this book. This is an adult contemporary romance. A girl goes to Alaska because I think her dad is sick and she's been estranged from him for a long time. She's like a city girl. She goes to Alaska and she meets this guy while she's up there, you know, re-meeting her dad after 13 years, 11 years, some long time. And her and the guy like fall in love. But the guy, everyone, okay, first off, everyone talks about this, or they had talked about it, as being so good, like slow burn and angsty and like enemies to lovers and blah, blah, blah. He is a douche. Like, he is a douchebag. He's mean to her from the get-go for like really no reason. I had so many issues with this book. It's one of the books that I actually rated like very low on this list. It wasn't just disappointing because of my expectations, it was also like bad. He, like, I don't pull for their relationship at all. He's like hyper masculine alpha male type dude. He's mean to her from the get-go for like reasons that are not valid. Like, it's not just like a misunderstanding like a lot of books do with these like enemies to lovers things. Like, he makes fun of her like clothes. He steals her luggage at one point. He makes fun of her for like ordering like a non-milk latte when she's lactose intolerant. He doesn't know that, but it's still like, why would you? He always is like, oh, you look better without makeup. Like, it's just, bleh. Like, I did not like it. And so many people were like, oh my god, this is so good, but no. And then not only that, there was a lot of stuff with the relationship, but also with her dad, and like the book and the narrative and all the characters basically have her being like, you need to forgive your dad. And it's like, he was the adult when she was the child, and he like abandoned her, and we don't get to just be like, oh, well, it's hard for him to communicate. No. So yeah, this whole book was a whole big problem for me, and I'm mad at people who made me read it. Then we have a book that's going to be on so many lists, and this wasn't my most disappointing read because I didn't have as high of hopes for it as many people did. That's A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. So I love the Hunger Games series, but it's been a while since I read it, so it wasn't sitting as much in my feelings as so many people who had reread the series right before this came out. And that like fandom in the series is not one of my like defining fandoms. It's still pretty like high up there. I still really liked it, but it's not one that like I resonate and think about all the time like some people do. So this doesn't hurt me as much. However, it was still really bad. Like, it was just, oh my god. It was our House Salt book club pick for that month, and we still talked about it. We just did a wrap-up video of like all the books that we read for House Salt book club this year in our live show for the December live show. And all of us were still like, oh my god, like it was just, not only was it like bad, and it was still like decently written because it's Suzanne Collins or whatever, but like, what was the point? And why do we get this book in 2020 of all years? Like, how dare you? This is so not the story that anyone wanted or needed. Blech. Like, I get there'll be some people in the comments that are like, I liked it, and like, whatever, it's fine to be wrong. I was gonna say it's fine to be wrong, but then people are gonna get mad at me. Whatever. I think it was bad, and it's my video. So that's the truth, as long as we're right here. The next book has a theme that happens a few times on this list, and that is Well Played by Jen DeLuca. So Well Met by Jen DeLuca was on my favorite books of the year list. Well Played was a second book in the series, and while it wasn't like horrible, I think I gave it 3 stars, it was so disappointing when I looked at like how much I loved Well Met and how Well Played was just so and I think the big factor was like the thing that it hinged on was basically the guy catfishing the girl for like months, and even into parts of their relationship. One character is the character that was in the first book, so we kind of know her, but she thinks she's talking to the guy's brother, who she'd had a fling with, and she's really talking to like the guy who is his, or maybe it's his cousin. I think it might be his cousin. Anyway, they're related. So they form this like long distance email relationship, and then she finds out, and then more stuff comes out later that I'm forgetting, but basically the whole, like, I couldn't really be into it because like he was lying to her, and like they set up their whole relationship on this like foundation of lies, and it, like some of it, like it makes sense sort of how it happened, but it didn't need to, like the miscommunication didn't need to continue as long as it did, and it ultimately made me not pull for them as much. And it also wasn't really set in the Ren Fair as much. The first book had like a lot of Ren Fair stuff, and I think the third book will too. Again, I have really high hopes for this third book. But this one was less set in the Ren Fair and had like other things going on, and because they were sort of like dating long distance through this like email thing, you didn't see a lot of them like together. So it just had a lot of elements that didn't work for me when book one worked for me so well. Then we have Seven Devils by Elizabeth May and Laura Lamb, and this is a book that's actually continued to go down in my feelings as time has gone by. Like, I've really forgotten a lot about it. This is one of my most anticipated books for this year and just did not live up to that. I think I might have given it a 3, but it might be like a 2, like the more that I have some distance from it. It's a science fiction series. I think it's an adult book. Again, I'm forgetting so much about it. We follow a couple different perspectives, but the big thing is you follow like a kind of little cast of characters, and I couldn't get connected to like any of them. I found myself not really caring. I'm forgetting so many parts about the book, and I expected this like female-led, almost feeling like Mass Effect, you know, I compare everything in space to Mass Effect story, and it just wasn't. Like, I just didn't care. I can't remember a lot of stuff about it. I think I read it in like July or August. Like, it hasn't been that long, and yet it's just gone from my brain, which just says something. I think I'm officially not going to continue with the series because I don't care. I said that I like maybe the next book could make things up to me, but like I don't remember. Sarah Jane and I read this together, and if she's watching this, Sarah Jane, do you remember any of this? I don't. They have a very similar thing to Well Played, and that is Undercover Bromance by Alyssa K. Adams. Same kind of thing happened. So I loved book one. Book one was on my favorites of the year list. Book two was such a disappointment. More so than Well Played was. Well Played I actually kind of liked. Undercover Bromance irritated me a lot of the time. Like, there were, I didn't really like the two characters that ended up getting together. There were so many elements that this has happened a lot in some romance books that I read this year. There were so many elements outside of the romance, which is fine if you have a couple and you do them really well. Like, one of my favorite books of the year, Beach Read, did that really well. But a lot of books don't do it very well. And so there were so many elements that the author added in that were a lot of like issue type things, like social justice-y type issues, which is great, but she had like so much in there that it was like plot soup. Like, there was just too many elements. We got distracted from the couple, and if you're reading a romance book, the main plot is supposed to be the romance. That's not true if you're writing like a contemporary, just like fiction or something else. But if you're writing a romance, the main plot is the romance. And like, there was just a lot happening, and then they both were like really kind of unlikable at times. Her more than him even, and she was not super likable in the first book because she's the sister of the girl in the first book. Anyway, it was just like a whole mess, and I like loved the first book so much. So these like second book slumps in these romance series are upsetting to me. Then we have Where Dreams Descend by Janella Angelis, and this is a book I DNF'd. This is so disappointing because I was so hyped for this, one of my most anticipated books, I think of the year, or at least of the season that it came out. This was the first book in a YA duology, I want to say, and it was supposed to be like Moulin Rouge meets The Night Circus kind of meets Phantom of the Opera. So there's like a magical competition and like whatever. I read like maybe 50 pages of this and like could not continue because the writing style like wasn't jiving with me like at all, and it was just like I could not care less. Like, and this should have been perfect for me, perfect, and it was just I couldn't even connect to it, which says a lot because I don't DNF that often. Of the, you know, I've read over 100 books this year, and I DNF'd 6 books. So I don't DNF a ton. Like, usually I can connect to something, and like, I just could not, which is very sad. Then we have In 5 Years by Rebecca Searle, and this is a adult, again, marketed as a romance. Very similar to The Flat Share. We'll notice some similar themes with some of the things that happened here in my disappointing reads, but it was marketed as a romance. The whole thing in the synopsis, our main character is engaged to this guy, falls asleep, and wakes up 5 years later with a different ring on, with a different guy, and like they start having sex basically. And then she wakes up again in the past, and then the 5 years pass and she meets the guy, and well, like really like 4 years and 6 months pass. She meets the guy and it's her best friend's boyfriend, and everything kind of goes from there. This is not a romance book. This is a contemporary fiction. The whole thing that was done with that whole like plot point, I get why it was done. It wasn't necessary. The way that she ultimately did it at the end was like kind of interesting, but ultimately like you didn't need it for the story, and it makes the story feel like it's going to be something that it's not. It's not a romance book. It's really about her and her friend and their relationship, and like her finding her own identity outside of her like perfectionism and stuff. So the book itself is actually like pretty decent if you go in not expecting it to be a romance book. But since I expected a romance book and was told by the synopsis and it was categorized as a romance book, I was disappointed because I was waiting the whole time for the romance part, and like that never happened. If I would have gone in knowing what it was going to be, it would have been way better, because it's not a badly written book. It's just the whole thing and the synopsis hinging on this, like, you know, almost like magical realism element of like, did she sort of time travel through the future, whatever. It didn't need to happen. Like, you didn't need to have that at all. You could have cut that out completely and it still would have been fine. It was cool the way it was done, but it still would have been fine. So that was disappointing because I expected something totally different. And lastly is the Falconeer series by Elizabeth May. I mean, I only read the last 2 books this year, but I've been talking about this book series a lot lately because I just read it in December, or I finished the last 2 books in December. But this is a YA fantasy series. It's Buffy the Vampire Slayer kind of in Scotland with Fae. And the reason that this was disappointing was because I expected this series to be a 5-star series or maybe like a 4-star series, because this is like an underhyped series, but the people that love it or have like a cult following for it and like adore it. So I thought I was gonna be like obsessed and discover like my new favorite like gem, undercover gem, you know, and I didn't. This was like a 3-star series the whole way through for me, which is fine. It's like fine. It was totally readable. It was like, it was fun, whatever. I'm glad I read it so I can recommend it to people that like Fae series. It was just like whatever for me. So much so that I had it down here because I'm gonna like probably unhaul it because I just don't love it that much. It was 3 stars for me. So yeah, this was fine. I have a review for it, so I'll link that on the screen, but like I expected 5-star perfection. And it wasn't. So that is it for my most disappointing reads of the year. Comment down below, let me know some books that disappointed you this year. Thank you all for watching and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.